Welcome to our daily reflection for this Friday, July 4th. And happy 4th of July, Independence Day here in America. And it's the day we celebrate our freedom. And we know that freedom requires sacrifice. And that's what we're going to see. That's true at the national, at the political level, but also relates to a spiritual truth that if we're going to be spiritually liberated and free, it requires sacrifice. It oftentimes requires a fight. And we see that in the gospel today. Matthew is called to follow Jesus, and so he has to make a sacrifice. He has to give up his old life and his old ways and his comfort and his wealth in order to be free spiritually to follow Jesus Christ. And we too need to be free and make sacrifices to be spiritually free. And it would be a poor paradox if we had the freedom to worship God in our country, but we didn't exercise that freedom and we became spiritually enslaved to sin. And that's one of the great revelations that Jesus gives, is that there's different kinds of slavery. And, there's a physical slavery, and that's horrible. There's political tyranny, and that's terrible. But there's also a spiritual that we can become enslaved to sin. And there's no room for interior freedom when we're enslaved to sin. And that makes it the worst form of slavery that there is. And so we want to be liberated by that. And so we pray about that today. Now, there's besides the gospel, I wanted to mention the first reading, and something that was rather, in a sense, mundane and unimportant, seemingly, about the first reading. But I think it reflects a deep biblical truth that's very important for our faith. And what is that? Well, the story here in Genesis 23 talks about how Abraham's wife Sarah dies. And Abraham is a sojourner. He's got sheep and goats, and he's basically nomadic lifestyle. And he dwells amongst some of the Hittites who possessed the land at that time. And he does something interesting. He goes to them and he says, my wife has died. I need to buy some land so I can bury my wife. And now, it was typical for a lot of pagan people, a lot of ancient people in the ancient world, to burn a body after someone has died. That's the easiest way of disposing with a body. But Abraham is going to take a much more difficult route, which was going to be in Abraham himself, but it's going to become the tradition of the Jews and then Judeo-Christian tradition. The Christians will follow this Jewish practice of wanting to bury the body of a beloved dead person. And so securing the land for that, so that there can be a proper burial, is very important. Now, why does Abraham take the pains to do this? And we find that his descendants will likewise do this. When we get to the end of the book of Genesis, when we get to Genesis 49, we're going to see that his grandson, Jacob, will tell the Israelites, bring my body back to Israel when I die, as I'm dying. He requests, he makes them swear an oath. He wants his children to make sure his body is taken back. And so Joseph leads the 12 sons in a great procession with a lot of Egyptians back to the promised land to bury Jacob in the very cave where Abraham buries Sarah, where Abraham will be buried, where Isaac and Rebekah will be buried, and then Jacob himself. And then Joseph, when he dies in chapter 50 of Genesis, at the very end of Genesis 50, he says, when I die, he makes the children of Israel swear an oath that they will bring his bones back to the land of Israel when God visits them to bring them out of Egypt. And so they will do that. Moses will do that. And so, again, all this extra work and effort at, burying a body when, cremation would be easier and cheaper. Why do they do that? And, it's interesting. Jacob says, I want to be regathered with my ancestors, with my people, and with my fathers. And so there's a certain sense, although it's not acute and clear yet, about an afterlife. There's a sense that the soul abides and that the body needs to be taken care of. And that's why the worst thing that can happen is to leave a body unburied. That is the worst form of cursing in the Old Testament and for the people of Israel. To not bury a body is a great, great thing because it has something to do with the settling of the soul in the afterlife. And so burying the dead and then praying for the dead affects one's afterlife. And that's very important early on. And we see this with Abraham, and we see it with Jacob and Joseph. And so the idea of the body being important and the afterlife being related is going to be fully revealed later on and by the end of the story of the Old Testament with Ezekiel the prophet and Daniel, that there'll be a physical resurrection and that God will raise our body in resurrection. And so the body, even though it is separated from the soul and that there is no life in the body will be regained in the end by the resurrection. And so this is, in a sense, Abraham, by going to the trouble of buying the land and burying Sarah and treating her body with great dignity, is showing a faith in the afterlife and showing a hope in resurrection. And here it's appropriate and fitting that the father of Abraham, the father of faith, Abraham, already has not fully developed doctrine of resurrection, but he already has in seed, in a very first formation, this idea of faith in the afterlife. So in sum, we're to think about the importance of the body and its burial as a sign of hope in the resurrection of the body at the end, at the last day, in the final resurrection. And that should give us hope indeed. May the Lord bless and keep you.
This daily reflection is brought to you thanks to the generous support of the Mission Circle. Join the Mission Circle to help Catholics worldwide understand, live, and share their faith. Sign up at missioncircle.org today.